Connie. As noted, I am Kristin Bullok, a benefit risk scientist at Eli Lilly and Company. I am also privileged to be included in the Prefer project, both on the communications team and as a recommendation development team member. My aim today is to provide a basic guide as to the why behind the framework developed by Prefer and to help familiarize you with the content. So starting with the why. There are many ways to collect patient views, and the use of these preferences are becoming increasingly important, which I will go into on the next slide. But broadly speaking, these terms around patient views are coalescing into three buckets, which I show here. First, the patient input or patient experience. This can include involvement in patient panels and representation at advisory committees. The patient perspective, as a subset of patient experience data, can be collected and used to develop core outcome sets and patient-reported outcomes. A smaller related subset to patient perspective are patient preferences. And the definition of these I will go into on the next slide, but what we're interested in here is how we can collect and use these patient preferences. So what I wanted to do here is distinguish patient preferences from patient-reported outcomes, which are a well-known output, particularly in clinical trials. With respect to preferences, on the left-hand side, they are qualitative or quantitative statements on the relative desirability or acceptability of attributes among health interventions. So essentially, this is the treatment profile of a drug or medical device. For example, an easy way to think about this is when you look at treatment A and the side effect profile and the benefits, which do you prefer when you compare that with treatment B? Whereas for patient-reported outcomes on the right-hand side of the slide are based on the status of a patient's health condition. And the patient reports on this without any interpretation from someone else. So essentially, it's a question of how did the treatment or intervention that you took make you feel? Collecting patient preferences is becoming increasingly important for medical product decision-making across the life cycle of a drug. One way that patient preferences can be used is to better understand patient-relevant endpoints and to understand the acceptability of a particular benefit-risk trade-off. However, when it comes to using patient preferences as substantial evidence for decision-making, for example, from a regulatory perspective, there's limited experience. But this gap provides an opportunity to create a framework. As Connie noted before, frameworks have been used in the past, and the advantages of a framework are to, for example, drive consistency of use for that certain subject, or it can provide a common understanding of how researchers can approach the problem. So therefore, I Prefer, created the framework that I'm about to go into detail for you. As you saw from Connie, this is the high-level overview of the Prefer framework. It's comprised of three components, which in and of themselves also have subsets. Today, however, I will focus only on component 1 and component 2, as our other speakers will talk about in more detail component 3. So first, what is the purpose of this Prefer framework for patient preference studies? It is simply to inform study teams on what they should consider when they're designing and conducting studies, but it also helps guide decision makers when they use the preference results to inform their decision making. It is important, however, that preferences and the design of preference studies are not conducted in a vacuum. So we don't need a preference study for everything. What we focus on in the Prefer framework is the use of preference studies when there is a preference-sensitive situation or decision to be made. And I'll go into the definition of this in a couple slides. It is also important to create, design, and conduct these studies in collaboration with the relevant stakeholders, especially those who are making the decision. So those that I've noted here are patients, and we have included them in the Prefer project as research partners, not just as participants who are involved in the study. And also regulators and HTA bodies and payers are important to consider when designing and developing the study. For the Prefer Framework Component 1, going more into detail, the study purpose is comprised of 3 points, which I'll go into on the next slide. And then the study objective takes these points and helps the study team describe how the study will inform the decision that is to be made. So first, when we think about the anatomy of a study purpose, the decision makers can be an HTA body, a regulatory agency, or it can be a patient advocacy group who wants to better understand the preferences of their members. Of course, it can also be industry and how they want to move the medical product along the life cycle. But again, as I noted before, the Prefer framework focuses on studies that are conducted to inform a preference-sensitive decision. And this is when we need to understand patients' views on the most important outcomes for a disease treatment because they are unclear. And then it could also be that there's no treatment option available that is clearly superior to another. And we would like to get the perspective of the patient who actually will be taking the medical intervention on which ones they would prefer. Tolerance for uncertainty on treatment effects can also be unclear, and this can be another preference-sensitive situation. So finally, wrapping up study purpose, it's very important to clearly define whose preferences you are collecting. So that includes the disease and or why the treatment is going to be given, and then of course the various characteristics. Then now moving on to component 2, organization. Briefly, as indicated on this slide, you want to conduct studies with people who are intimately involved in the disease state or have knowledge of it and the associated treatments, as well as study team members who are well-versed in preference methodology. Depending on the study purpose, you may also want to include the regulatory and or HTA body that will be informed about the preference study, and as well as a statistician or someone who, of course, can analyze the data and help you best interpret it. With respect to study timing, there's just a few tips that the Prefer framework provides, but essentially it's basically thinking with the end in mind. So if you need a study to inform a decision of whether you're going to move forward with the drug, you need to make sure that you have adequate time to conduct that study and have the results available by the time the decision needs to be made. So of course you need to think through how long will this study take, how long will it take to recruit the participants, etc. Then now moving into a large aspect of component 2, which is design. As all studies that use human subjects, of course, we need to solicit informed consent before we can move forward with this study, as well as we want these study materials to be reviewed by ethics committees. The sample definition essentially describes the characteristics of those that you are going to recruit into your study. You can think of these as inclusion-exclusion criteria for a clinical trial. But the framework describes how we can set this up, and your sample definition needs to align with your study purpose, and also consider representativeness. So how applicable will the results be to the target broader patient population? And then, if appropriate, depending on the age of the sample or the participants that you're including and or the cognitive abilities, you may want to include caregivers. So briefly touching on methods, as Brett will go a little bit more in detail on this. High level, fit the study purpose. And then the method also needs to take into account how large the study will be. Really, this comes into consideration when you're looking at rare diseases. So a rare disease, of course, will mean that there are fewer participants you can recruit. It will take longer. But also you may not be able to have as large of a sample size, and some methods may require larger sample sizes than others. With respect to preference question design, which is essentially the meat of your entire study, this involves developing your instrument or the discussion guide that you will be using to collect the actual preferences from your participants. And when we say preference question, it is not just the questions. There are many parts, including the ones that I list here with respect to context for the study, actual questions. And then before you start and conduct the study, you need to make sure that all the materials that you will put in front of your participants are understood in the intended manner. Finally, it's very important to consider what will be the study burden. What is the length of the study, how much mental effort is needed for the participants to put in their preferences. So going a little bit more in detail on the main elements of preference question design of context, alternatives, and assessing. I briefly went into context already, but basically it is describing why the participant is participating and what will be asked of them. So example, it explains a situation that the participant needs to think about when they're answering the question. This kind of example, it could be, assume that there is a hypothetical treatment to slow your cognitive decline, which we need you to understand the different treatment options that could be available and compare them. So that is an example of what the situation could be that you would present in front of your participants in your question design. Alternatives essentially describes the different aspects of the treatment that you're going to be asking the participants about. But it's really critical that what you include in there are meaningful to the participants. So, for example, for a patient preference study, if you are not understanding previous preferences of patients, you may need to do a pre-study or qualitative study to initially get these attributes or characteristics into your preference design. Alternatively, you can comb the literature and understand treatment preferences as well as standard of care that's out there. For assessing, this again means that you want to make sure whatever materials you put in front of the participant, particularly the questions and the context, are understood in the intended manner. And then, of course, you need to revise your study materials to make sure that they reflect the learnings from that assessment. Finally, the last part of component 2 of conduct. Again, I'm going to be focusing only on the elements of study conduct here, which are, of course, recruiting and collecting the data. So this requires a screening of your participants, similar to a clinical trial. You need to make sure that the participants that are included meet the inclusion-exclusion criteria, for example, and that the data are stored in the appropriate manner, particularly with respect to rules and regulations of the country in which the study is conducted or will be used to inform a decision. Once the data are collected, the next step is, of course, analyzing and interpreting your data. But what's important here that the Prefer framework points out is we need to have pre-planned, pre-specified analyses to minimize bias, for example. And then it is acknowledged that there will be, more than likely, post hoc analyses once the data arrive and are first analyzed using pre-planned analyses. So what you should do in your design part is make sure that you have an approach specified for how you will handle these needs as they arise with respect to post hoc analyses. Finally, it is important for transparency to write up your study results, not just for your decision maker, but also for the participants who have provided the data for you. So then finally, briefly touching on component 3 with respect to how, so now you have your data, how are you going to use that data to inform your decision making? So Bennett will go into this in detail, but briefly, component 3 is made up of 3 elements. The common ways preference data can be applied or used, the technical methods behind your preference data application, and then also some suggestions for how preference data that has been used to inform regulatory or HTA decision-making, how that can be made public. So in closing, the foundation for the PREFER framework on preference studies is the belief that patients' views should be considered in medical product development, and that well-designed and conducted preference studies are one way to include these patient views. And the PREFER framework, as I noted before, is intended to help increase the appropriate use of patient preference studies across the medical product lifecycle. Thank you very much for your attention, and I now hope that you have a basic understanding of the PREFER framework. All of this information will be provided in more detail in the PREFER qualification briefing book once the public consultation has opened. So if you have any questions, please continue to insert them into the chat, and we will answer them at the end of this webinar. And now I ask Brett Hauber to provide you more information on the points to consider when selecting a method. Thank you.